Our current situation is one unlike anything we have personally faced, definitely in our lifetimes, and for our country, probably not for close to the last 100 years. If you follow any social media or news or other outlets, you can't help but hear comparisons to other troubled times that we've been through, both nationally and globally. We recently spoke on here with Terry Birdwhistle about the university's response to the 1918 flu pandemic. We also speak of the coronavirus pandemic in terms of war and as an enemy to combat. Our guest today on Behind the Blue is Dr. John Thelin, a longtime University of Kentucky professor of higher education and public policy, the author of A History of American Higher Education, and also Going to College in the 60s. Dr. Thelin, thank you so much for being with us today.
A real pleasure. Thank you.
So the first question I want to ask, higher education has been through chaotic times like we're currently experiencing, from the Great Depression to world wars, civil rights demonstrations. Are these a good analogy to what we're facing now, or is this different? How do those moments compare to this?
I think the continuity through all the various crises is that campuses have not been ivory towers. They've been involved. And usually, I think, in a helping and supportive way. They've tried to help out local, state, and federal governments to provide solutions, to provide havens, services. The difference is that with this pandemic, we're getting two simultaneous shocks to the system. And one is obviously public health. The also is that the economic crisis is actually tending to shut much of the campus down. So although it would like to help, it's difficult for it to do so.
So is this, Dr. Thelin, is this unlike anything higher education has ever faced then?
Well, I think that Dr. Terry Birdwhistle covered well in a very interesting case that probably is the closest approximation. The difference is that it is 100 years later, which means on the one hand, universities and other institutions may have more tools to provide solutions. On the other hand, today, rather than a century ago, the speed with which problems can arise, like movements of populations, crossing of boundaries. So we have both more solutions, but also more problems.
So do you, given those both differences and similarities, what do you take from those periods of time, whether it's 1918 and the Spanish flu or the Depression? Are there things that are guides for higher education today, and then are there things that you would say, well, that doesn't apply here, and so this is a bigger challenge?
One interesting coincidence was that prior to the pandemic, campuses were very involved with what was called the SATC, which was a mobilization of the campus to provide all kinds of training and programs on campus that led to military service. And I think that those were put into place before the pandemic. So you actually had this bizarre collision that tended to interrupt or cancel the service that campuses were giving. The other thing is, I think that the 1918 influenza had far more impact on concentrations of populations, for example, in military bases, where something like Fort Riley, Kansas, the troops were finishing up boot camp, and they knew there was a large incident of infection, and yet they decided to send them by train to New York and then by ships to France to serve in World War I. And as a result, some huge proportion of those recruits died knowingly of influenza. So I think we've avoided that kind of catastrophe in with some of the home sheltering. And close. If you had asked me in January whether there would be such universal closing down of like having students leave dormitories and having faculty and staff leave their offices, I really would not have predicted that. Although, Jay, I see that you're still on campus, although 6 feet from the Wildcat statue.
That's right. I'm practicing appropriate social distancing at home. That's true.
So, universities, larger universities like the University of Kentucky, we talked about the flu pandemic in 1918 and how we were so much more of a different university at that time. And we were much more agriculturally based. We had a much smaller population in Lexington, a much smaller population on campus. A lot of those students were coming to the university and then they were going back to their home areas, to their farms and things like that. Now we're such a large institution and we have so many moving pieces and parts, whether it's students that are from out of state or international, the research arm that we do, the medical side of our campus, all of those things for a larger university like the University of Kentucky. Does it make things more challenging to face something like this right now because you have all of those external pieces and parts, or does it put us at an advantage to at least have those touch points outside of our campus?
Your timing in the question is bittersweet, because what I was thinking about the week when the decision was made for University of Kentucky students to leave their dormitories, I was thinking, first of all, the simultaneous decision by a number of other universities. I was thinking, I would not want to be in the Atlanta airport with literally what would be tens, hundreds of thousands of students and other university personnel going through, certain central travel checkpoints. So the intention of the solution is excellent, but I think there are going to be some side effects with all that demographic change of just travel of leaving campus. So yes, I think you're absolutely right. If you look at the size of even the largest universities of 1918, probably a relatively large campus would have been like 9,000. So with enrollments, for example, at UK of 30,000, or in the Big Ten, 60,000, the permutations for interaction and exposure just have compounded dramatically.
A lot of our focus now is on, all we hear about is researching the coronavirus and trying to find as much information as we can, which would lead to a vaccine, trying to find particular testing for antibodies. But just like everything else, we still have people who are working in other areas of research. They are affected as well by this. What happens to research in a time like this? What challenges do they face with this?
Yeah, my inference would be is that a great deal of sponsored research probably has been certainly curtailed, maybe even shut down. I don't know what the guidelines are on like essential personnel, but let's say, for example, in some other high priority medical research, let's say, for example, diabetes research or our Markey Cancer Center. If the lockdowns are fairly pervasive, I would tend to think that their vital research is going to be slowed down and curtailed. And also I think that federal agencies that provide so much of the funding, they're going to be hampered in their work. So I think that the price, unfortunately, we're going to pay is pretty substantial.
And that would be specifically with respect to research. That's potentially a pretty big price for the country too, isn't it? I mean, when you look at the amount of research that's done on behalf of therapies and therapeutics and pharmacies and all that's a huge issue for the country to wrestle with as well, isn't it?
Yes, and the Los Angeles Times had an article about 3 days ago when they were looking at some estimates on the impact of the 10 campus or 11 campus University of California system. And what was interesting and surprising to me was that a large part of the University of California deficits were going to be due to canceled or postponed surgeries. And so to me, that illustrates how integral academic medical centers have become to the overall health delivery, whether from treatments to surgeries or whatever. And so one external threat has substantially changed and curtailed and reduced the myriad other good services that we look to universities to provide. And I would add one other thing to go back to Cody's observation. I think in just about every major city, the largest employer is a university. That's certainly true with Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. It's true with Harvard in the greater Boston area. It's true with the University of Kentucky. It's actually also true with Columbia in New York City. So the universities are not marginal players in this drama.
So put your public policy hat on for a minute and prognosticate. If you were president of a major university, what are the questions you would be asking? What are the concerns you'd have, and what do you think that everybody likes to talk about a new normal? What does that look like for universities?
First, let me preface that in that I did not anticipate the extent of closures and curtailments that presidents nationwide undertook. Given that they have, my estimate is they would not have done so capriciously or without good information. The pretty drastic move, things such as events such as commencement, let alone all regular instruction and whatever. So to me, the message from my colleagues as presidents is that it was a hard but informed decision. And I think that universities are going to have to be pretty cautious in retooling and regaining momentum. I think everything from the public health threats and also legal liability on hasty reopening, I think are going to give pause. So that leaves us with some very undetermined ways of coping, and certainly the ability to respond quickly with internet has been, I think, a very good immediate response, but I think it won't be adequate over the long haul for how universities and colleges reconfigure their operations.
It's impossible to say what things we are going to miss out on or lose during this time when we talk about research, the setbacks that we are facing. But with the Depression, for example, or World War II, we saw a lot of public works projects and improvements that came out of that time. Do we see a silver lining of that sort possible this time around?
We certainly haven't seen it yet. And it's interesting, if one were to take a walk around the University of Kentucky campus, you would go over, say, by Lafferty Anthropology Laboratory, and I believe what was, I guess, the old Student Center. There were some remarkable Works Progress Administration construction. I don't foresee that. And one reason is that in the 1930s, not only were our campuses much smaller, they were less mature as an enterprise or as an institution. Now they're full-fledged adults. They're not in late adolescence. They're in midlife, and it's going to be more difficult to add new programs. And And also a big difference is that during the Depression, you had an economic crisis, but you did not have a public health crisis. So the campus today faces many more obstacles to being the center of activity and energy. So the losses, I think, are going to be pretty substantial. And I don't know where the new growth would be.
What does something like that do to a generation, a group of, whether it's the graduating class from this year or incoming freshmen? We don't know really how long this process is going to take, and obviously there are going to be some major effects on this generation. What does that happen? What does that look like?
I think the responses are going to be diametrically opposite. On the one hand, there is going to be the sense of a lost generation, where everything from students, families, faculty, staff will feel this irreplaceable void. If, for example, if you have missed commencement, you've missed it. And then into more substantive activities, the same thing. Now, the opposite interesting response is, I think, that close downs and suspensions are going to increase the desire and appreciation that many Americans have had for what we would more or less call the real campus or traditional campus life. I think that so that although internet instruction provides very good additions to delivering courses and information and teaching and learning, it cannot fully replace the numerous in-person activities of students and faculty, of social life, clubs, discussions, Greek life, spectator sport, and so on. So that the real campus, I think, is going to be missed very, very greatly.
One of those areas that you've written extensively about is, of course, athletics. And you were a member of the Knight Commission at one point, as I recall, which looked at reforms. What do you think there's some particular impacts on athletics that we'll be looking at and talking about and thinking about? That's a model that has been questioned a lot in recent years. What do you see there?
Well, obviously, the immediate impact of the cancellation of so many teams and sports in the spring. Once again, I would have not predicted the decisive actions, for example, to cancel the Final Four or whatever. So right off the bat, you're going to have a big financial shortfall. Then questions, I think, of spectators, and what are the trade-offs and risks of having spectators, anything like traditional numbers, closely packed in a stadium or an arena, is going to be slow to be resolved. One extreme model that I might see for not only college sports but professional as well is more reliance on television with embargoes on live spectators, which would be a very, very difficult compromise. It'd really be a half a loaf. But there's so much dependence on television, cable, internet, or whatever, that there possibly might be some compromise to have games go on, but limiting the public in terms of being in person.
What are moving through this, what are some of the biggest questions that you feel like we will find ourselves asking from maybe a university administrative point or maybe a faculty point as an approach to how I teach my classes, to even families that are making considerations for going on to college? What are questions that we will ask ourselves about this?
I think you're going to have a generation of university and college leaders, from presidents through provost, deans, that are being cast into a situation for which there was little prior preparation. For faculty, If our dependence on internet and our reduction of traditional campus instruction, whatever, were to continue, I think it will change very much the character and nature of the academic profession, and possibly decisions of potential new scholars. Was this the professional life which I wanted to enter? I think it's that dramatic of a change. Zoom meetings are excellent, particularly this one, but they're very tiring. And at the end of the week or the end of the semester, I'm sure that you feel, that lack of collegial interaction in 101 ways, formal and informal. And so I think it will change the magnetism of academic life.
Do you think we see colleges changing in a sense of, one of the things that I've read about or heard about recently is just how the very structure and nature of our economic system, and how in this country especially we have kind of outsourced to a point to where that's where we're seeing problems in trying to get like medical supplies, PPE equipment, things like that. Do you think that we will see universities kind of changing in a sense of like how they do business, as far as like, we just aren't going to, like we offer different majors now than we did before. We offer we've shifted in some ways our curriculum.
I think there could be reconsiderations on curriculum. I think that the greater logistical problems will be, for example, in a campus that has such a strong academic medical center, where you mention things like the kind of microcosm of the supply chain, where it's not only a matter of delivering courses, whether by Zoom or internet or in person, but at some point there's provisions of services such as surgery, or such as seeing a patient, or working with experiments that it's hard to envision them not being done in some in-person, real-time way. That's where I think the added functions of a research university are going to be more scrutinized. I think that if you go back to the more simple, the more essential things like instruction, those could be handled a little more readily. But it's the interactions professionally and with constituencies that it's going to just be very, very difficult to resolve.
Do you feel like that institutions like ours, or just higher ed in general, if you look at public opinion polling, would suggest that large institutions, but universities too, have not only been under a lot more scrutiny, but have had sort of losses of confidence in them among the public. Do you think this exacerbates that further, or is there an opportunity for some institutions that are enterprising and innovative or for people to think back about what they liked about these systems?
I would say that my jury's out on that. I don't immediately sense that the pandemic has caused a further decline in confidence in our universities. I think it's more just an uncertainty. If anything, it might bring to the fore our interdependence and our wanting to have the various public services that universities provide. So it may, in a bittersweet way, exaggerate how important universities have become. And then with this puzzle for many groups to try to resolve of how do you recast that in some manageable way.
Well, we don't want to take up too much of your time today. As you said, you probably have a lot of Zoom meetings, and those can pile up and pile up. Is there anything that we haven't touched on you feel like might be important to kind of point out or to think on?
But one thing that I think is a pleasant surprise is that I think that a range of colleges and universities responded promptly. And I think they they took on the hard decisions, and I think they were informed, and that the fact that they did not just drag out as business as usual and in denial, I think is a compliment to universities trying to look out for what is, the commonwealth and the public good. But we're left with some very interesting uncertainties that we can't even start to resolve yet because we don't know what the landscape's going to be.
Well, Dr. John Thelin, thank you so much for being with us today. We very much appreciate it, and continue taking care of yourself.
Thank you so much. Good to see you, and I'll look forward to seeing you not only virtually but actually.
Absolutely.
Stay well.
Thank you.